10 ideas that will blow your mind about the origins of humanity. And the first question that I learned, and as I've started digging down this rabbit hole about 5 years ago, which led me to you, was that human civilizations were told roughly they started recorded human history, and correct me on my numbers, around 6,000 years ago. But we're basically told that the original humans were only, I think, is it 20,000 years old, roughly? Is that correct? Am I right about that, or are my numbers off?
Well, it depends on if you're talking about how they talk about like the pre-Homo sapiens sapien, like getting into Denisovans and a Neanderthal. That's where the disconnect comes in, where we're looking at this. We're like, okay, well, what are we? Are we just one of these pre-hominid Neanderthal Denisovans, or is there a lot more to the story? And that's where that timeline. What we're really talking about here is not when pre-humans ever started and existed on the planet, but when did civilization begin? And when did we go from being hunter-gatherers to something that's much more sophisticated? And that story is actually recorded in ancient tablets and texts around the world and in stories, and it's not anything like we're told in books. It's completely different, and there's a reason why that is the way it is. And I don't know if you want me to just keep going or you had a follow-up on that.
No, I don't have a follow-up. So that first question is how old, based upon your research and your science and your data, is human civilizations? And sort of, if you may, kind of tell us where it all began from your perspective.
Sure.
And I would like to know as well, sorry, as we load you with questions, the reason why we're told a different story.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting history of how this all got started. Basically, the beginnings of all of this was, I guess you could say, a certain group of intellectuals, part of certain secret societies. And esoteric secret societies go back thousands and thousands of years. Some of the first ones we know of were in Babylon, and they were part of these groups that were priests and high knowledge individuals that knew a lot more than the rest of the population. And they realized that one of the biggest threats that could exist is us truly understanding what we are and how significant we are to the planet and the universe, and so much more than we know. And all of that information, though, is not just someone's perspective. It's been recorded in ancient text for thousands and thousands of years earlier than we even have or is admitted in school on when civilizations were sophisticated. Basically, what we need to do is have an understanding of science and geology and climate for, like we were taught. Like, don't just reject all of it. Like, have a basis for some of those things, but then be open-minded to say, well, maybe this thing isn't quite right, and maybe this isn't quite right, and we need to rethink about how these pieces fit in. And I just want to give a brief example of that before I talk about where civilization started. In school, I remember being very almost depressed with the idea that we're just this advanced ape that somehow through Darwinism rose up through survival of the fittest, and here we are just sort of conquering our world, and that consciousness was being derived from the brain. And that's really what school teaches us. Now, the thing to mention about school is that the entire education system in the United States was developed by the Rockefeller Institution. Now, there was a curriculum that was basically developed where this is how you have to talk about biology, you have to talk about history, you have to talk about all these things have to be in this laid out format. And if the teacher was to be like, well, wait a minute, I don't know if I really fully agree with that. And if they were to try to not teach that same version, they would lose their license. They would not be able to teach. And so what you have is really and I know there's some amazing teachers that are out there that sort of push the limits a little bit and get people to critically think a bit. I know that does exist, but it's not the norm. Typically, you have a teacher that's just spouting off this regurgitated information that's the same as every other teacher. And that's why people have that curriculum is so well established. Well, that curriculum was very carefully decided. Okay. And that's the biggest point that needs to be understood here is that if you have a system of a society where people are doing all the various jobs that we're doing and we're living this various life, we have to have a perspective that goes from, well, what are we? What is consciousness? What is our significance here? And that plays into the entire scheme of how we view reality. And it plays into our understanding, well, okay, if we're just superior to to all the animal kingdom, and we've gotten here just by being like super smart. And some people think like, eating a bunch of magic mushrooms and all of a sudden like some apes thought up of new things. No, that's not what this is at all. There's a whole nother dynamic that we're going to get into. And I don't want to start with that because I think when we get to number 8, on the top 10, we get to number 8 is really when we're going to get into that conversation. Because what the problem is, if you throw too much information at someone in an unorganized fashion, they're going to reject the message. And so what we need to do is we got to layer this on top of each other with evidence-driven content to understand, well, what is this great story? Are things much different than we're told? And the more that other individuals, if they're open-minded and they're able to just allow an idea to fester and see if there's any merit in it, and then and obviously go research for yourself. Anything I say, I highly hope that anyone goes and looks up themselves, because it doesn't matter who it is, me or anyone else. You don't just take anything for face value. You go and you look yourself. But we got to understand that you got to be very careful to look, and I know I'm going off on these like tangents, but we have to create a foundation first before I start talking about this.
Can I interrupt 1 second real quickly? So this conversation that we're about to go into is especially relevant for you, and I say this not because you don't have the entertainment of the same ideas that I do. Lisa grew up for roughly 30 years in a Mormon church, which the ideologies around that are very strict on the beliefs of creationism and Darwinism. And
you were saying 6,000 years. I'm like, that's what we were told.
So
the earth was created, blah, blah, blah.
So it's it's fantastic that you're starting off with this baseline, because most people, Lisa's not the minority in that belief, right? Like, we live in this Western society that is based on this conditional ideology of one God, one religion. So I love where you're starting this off. So sorry to interrupt.
Okay. No, awesome. That's good to expand on that. And what really we're talking about here, and you dabble down, it's known as the rabbit hole, and it's a term that's used way too much, but it's really the best way to look at it, because the more you look into these little pieces, these nuggets, the deeper you get down in. Before you know it, you're so far down it that the old paradigm of reality has now shattered all around you. Now, I want people to not be afraid of that. Why are people so afraid to entertain a new idea? If anything, you're going to feel a lot better when you're listening to him about to tell you about who we really are, because it's going to completely go against the mundane version that we're told. Even certain aspects of religion and Darwinism combine to create this very false narrative on who we are and how far back our story goes and how amazing we are. We are, and that's one of the highlights and the emphasis of this whole show. And that's the reason why the entire Education Institute, which is basically a conditioned mind control, has been created, because people, if they knew the truth of what we are and how significant we are to the entire cosmos, they wouldn't want to do mundane jobs. These jobs where they're going and they're working all their time, and then they're coming back and having these little snippets of free time, and then they realize like their whole life has been wasted. And I know that the pandemic has caused people having a lot of free time to start questioning that. And I know that's happened a lot of places around the world where people have all this free time. All of a sudden they're like, what have I been doing? And they start reevaluating their life, what happiness is, and what we could be doing here instead. So I know that goes off on all these different directions, but so let's lay down some foundations, okay? The foundations to lay down is, we're told in school that human civilizations emerged 6,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent of Sumer. Now, that's the area of Iraq, Iran, Syria, that whole area, which has like been in conflict for years and years and years, right? And subsequently, you can't go in there and excavate anything on an archaeological dig, which is very interesting, that we may get into that to talk about as well. Because that really, even though that timeline of 6,000 years is very inaccurate, it did begin there. But it began there much earlier than that. And the idea we're going to get across here that I want people to understand is, instead of a linear timeline, okay, instead of thinking, okay, we have primitive hunter-gatherers that are traveling around the world and they're all independent, and then all of a sudden, boom, civilization comes up 6,000 years ago, and then there's one linear civilization that then builds off of each other, and here we are, the most sophisticated. Tear that whole thing down, throw it away, and just imagine for a minute what I'm about to tell you. Try to have an open mind and understand that Instead of one linear timeline of a rise of civilization to where we are now, think about it more like civilizations have risen up from various influences that we'll talk about, and then fallen, and then risen, and then fallen at least 3, 4, maybe 5 times. And that is an incredibly important point to get across. Go ahead.
So I just want to recap what I just heard you say. So what you just said is that civilizations, humanity as we know it, and we live in this little bubble of, we're told 6,000 years or whatever. You're saying that the species of humans have existed before, or some version of hominids have existed before in a completely different silo and time period that was wiped out 3 or 4 times and started anew roughly.
Yeah, but not primitive though. That's the main point of this. Yes, hunter-gatherers did exist. I'm not saying that didn't, but something happened. There was a moment in time when certain knowledge and information was put into those civilizations, and then you saw rapid rises that came out of nowhere. And then certain cyclical disasters have occurred on the earth. We'll get into that in later number down the line here, that have been so severe that has literally destroyed those civilizations, caused them to all their knowledge to be almost wiped out, and then another civilization has had to build off of the remnants of that and then try to rise again. Now, every time that those falls have happened, it's the opposite of what we think. It's not that we've gained more, it's that we've lost more every time. Now, I'm not saying other civilizations were on the technological level with fast computers and cell phones and cars like we are now. We're talking about sophistication and knowledge on a completely different level, okay? And that was a perfect example. Why don't you go ahead and bring that up? Okay, this leads exactly into what we're talking about. What you're seeing on the screen, this is in South America. This is Machu Picchu, right? A famous place that most people have seen. These mountain temples, way up above 9,000 feet on top of the Andes Mountains, okay? Now, we're told in school, again, this linear model, that the Inca created Machu Picchu, all right? And then the Inca slowly were wiped out when they were conquered by the Spanish, when they systematically conquered the Americas, right? When Pizarro came ashore with his armies, went inland, and then caused the demise of the Inca. Completely wrong. What we're looking at right now, and notice on the screen the different building styles. That's what I want to present to you. That's why as we talk about this, the civilizations that we're going to be talking about are called either the lost civilizations, the master civilizations, or the megalithic civilizations. And megalithic means very, very large stones, okay? Now, I want to just really quickly add something to this. Imagine what would happen right now if our civilization got hit by a catastrophe like a coronal mass ejection from the sun that blasted our planet and caused massive tectonic shifts, and basically it wiped out our entire civilization, right? With tsunamis and just boom, volcanoes, and we were all wiped out, everyone, except small groups of people in these isolated pockets around the world. What would survive our civilization? I want everyone to think about that for a minute.